A U.S. military base in the Kuwaiti desert erupts into flames. Thick black smoke rises into the sky, visible for miles across the barren landscape. Sirens sound, personnel scramble, and within minutes, reports begin spreading that one of Iran's most powerful ballistic missiles may have just struck an American installation. According to Iranian military officials, the target was Camp Buehring, a major logistics hub used by U.S. forces for more than 2 decades. The strike, they say, was not random. It was a carefully sequenced assault involving drones, cruise missiles, and finally a massive ballistic missile, carrying one of the heaviest warheads Iran has ever deployed. Iranian sources claim multiple high-value targets were destroyed in the operation. Fuel storage facilities, helicopter maintenance zones, logistics centers, and parts of the base's command infrastructure. Witnesses described a massive fire breaking out after the impacts, with evacuation activity unfolding inside the perimeter of the base. And the weapon Iran says made the final strike possible is raising serious attention among military analysts. It's called the Khorramshahr-4, a missile capable of carrying a warhead, weighing over 1,500 kilograms while traveling at speeds reported to exceed Mach 14. But the strike itself may only be part of the story, because the timing of this attack was anything but accidental. The missiles were reportedly launched just hours after Iran announced a new supreme leader, following the death of the country's previous leader in a strike 10 days earlier. In other words, the attack and the leadership transition happened almost simultaneously. And Iranian officials are now signaling something even more concerning. They claim the weapons used so far in this conflict represent only a fraction of their modern arsenal. So what exactly happened at this U.S. base? What makes the Khorramshahr-4 missile different from the rest of Iran's arsenal? And why are Iranian military leaders describing this phase of the war as only the beginning? Hi, I'm Susan. In this video, we're going to break down what we currently know about the reported Iranian strike on Camp Buehring in Kuwait, how the attack was carried out, and why the missile reportedly used in the operation has drawn so much attention from defense analysts. We'll also look at the broader timing of the attack, because it came immediately after a major political shift inside Iran's leadership structure, a transition that may now be shaping the direction of the conflict. Over the next few minutes, we'll walk through the role of this base, the sequence of the attack itself, the capabilities of the Khorramshahr-4 missiles, and why Iranian officials are insisting that their newest weapons have barely been deployed yet. Because if their claims are accurate, what happened at this base may not be an isolated event. It could be part of a much larger strategy unfolding across the region. Camp Buehring sits deep in the northwestern desert of Kuwait, a sprawling logistics hub that has quietly supported American military operations across the Middle East for more than 2 decades. Established in 2003 during the Iraq War, the base was designed primarily as a staging and supply center, rather than a traditional frontline installation. From here, equipment moves across the Gulf, helicopters are assembled and maintained, and fuel supplies are stored and distributed for operations across the region. Over time, Camp Buehring became one of the key logistical backbones for U.S. forces operating in the Gulf. Helicopter units cycle through the base regularly. Maintenance teams service aircraft and vehicles. Supply chains feeding multiple American installations passed through this desert complex. For years, it operated largely outside the spotlight, far from the headlines that usually surround larger air bases or naval installations, but its location and role made it strategically important. And for more than 20 years, despite numerous regional conflicts, no foreign military had ever launched a direct strike against a U.S. base on Kuwaiti soil. That changed earlier this month. On March 1st, reports surfaced that an Iranian drone had struck Camp Buehring, marking the first known attack against the base. The incident immediately raised alarms, because it suggested that Iran was willing to expand the battlefield beyond traditional areas of confrontation. But what happened next was far more significant. 8 days later, on March 9th, Iranian forces reportedly returned with a much larger and far more coordinated operation. According to Iranian military statements, the strike involved multiple weapon systems operating in sequence. Drones were deployed first, flying ahead of the main strike package. Their role was likely to probe defenses, overwhelm radar coverage, and create confusion within the base's defensive systems. Shortly after the drones entered the area, cruise missiles were launched toward fixed infrastructure targets inside the base perimeter. These missiles are typically used to hit specific facilities with high accuracy. and Iranian sources claim they were aimed at aircraft maintenance zones, logistic structures, and command facilities within the base. But the final stage of the operation is what has drawn the most attention. After the drones and cruise missiles had already struck their targets, Iranian forces reportedly launched ballistic missiles toward the base. These weapons travel far faster than cruise missiles and descend from high altitude at extreme speeds, making them far more difficult to intercept once they enter their terminal phase. Iranian officials claim that these ballistic missiles struck key hardened infrastructure, including helicopter maintenance facilities, major fuel depots, and parts of the base's command structure. Following the impacts, witnesses described a massive fire erupting inside the installation, sending thick smoke columns rising above the desert. Satellite images and reports from individuals in the surrounding area described flames continuing to burn hours after the attack. Iranian sources later described the operation as one of the most significant single base strikes conducted during the conflict so far. But what makes the operation particularly notable is the specific weapon Iran says was used in the final stage of the attack, because the ballistic missile reportedly deployed in the strike is not just another weapon in Iran's inventory. It represents one of the heaviest payload delivery systems the country currently possesses. It's a missile designed specifically to deliver massive warheads against hardened military infrastructure. The missile, Iranian officials say, was used in the final stage of the strike is known as the Khorramshahr-4, sometimes referred to by its alternate name, Khar. It was officially unveiled by Iran in May of 2023, and from the moment it was introduced, defense analysts began paying close attention to what made it different from many of the other ballistic missiles already in Iran's arsenal. On paper, the numbers alone immediately stand out. The missile is classified as a medium-range ballistic missile, with an estimated range of roughly 11 and 30 miles. That range places a large portion of the Middle East well within reach. From launch positions inside Iran, the missile can theoretically cover every American installation across the Gulf region, including bases in Bahrain, Qatar, Kuwait, and the United Arab Emirates. The same range also places Israel entirely within its strike envelope and extends far enough to reach portions of southeastern Europe, including certain NATO infrastructure sites. But the defining feature of the Khorramshahr-4 is not its range. It is the weight of the payload it can carry. According to Iranian military disclosures, the missile is capable of delivering a warhead weighing around 1,500 kilograms, more than 3,000 pounds. That makes it the heaviest conventional payload in Iran's ballistic missile inventory. In practical terms, that amount of explosive mass allows the weapon to inflict severe damage on hardened military targets such as fuel depots, reinforced hangars, command buildings, and logistic infrastructure. Iranian state media has at times even described the payload as approaching 2 tons, emphasizing that the missile was specifically engineered to deliver overwhelming force against fortified installations rather than simply targeting wide areas. But the warhead is only part of the system. Underneath the missile structure sits a liquid fuel rocket engine known as the Arvand engine, designed to propel the missile to extremely high speeds during its boost phase. By the time the weapon enters its descent toward the target, it can be traveling at speeds exceeding Mach 14, which means it is moving more than 14 times the speed of sound. At those velocities, the window for interception becomes extremely small. What further complicates interception is the design of the missile's re-entry vehicle. The Khorramshahr-4 carries a separable, maneuverable re-entry vehicle, often referred to as a MARV. Once the missile completes its boost phase and begins descending toward its target, the warhead section separates from the main body of the missile. During this final stage, the re-entry vehicle is designed to make small adjustments to its trajectory. That capability allows it to alter its path slightly while descending at hypersonic speeds. The purpose of this maneuverability is to complicate missile defense systems. Interceptors such as the Patriot PAC-3 or the THAAD system rely on predicting the trajectory of incoming ballistic missiles. When a warhead can adjust its path during the final moments of flight, it becomes more difficult for those defense systems to calculate a precise interception point. Iranian officials claim the missile's guidance system combines inertial navigation with satellite-based corrections, allowing the weapon to refine its trajectory during flight and strike specific point targets. Instead of simply aiming at a general area, the missile can theoretically be directed toward particular structures inside a base. A fuel storage tank, a command building, or a runway intersection. This is why the missile has attracted so much attention from military analysts. It represents a weapon designed not only for long-range strikes, but for targeted destruction of critical infrastructure within military installations. And Iran has made another claim about the Khorramshahr-4 that could have significant implications for how quickly it can be deployed. Traditionally, liquid-fuel ballistic missiles have had one major weakness. Before they can launch, they must go through a fueling process. During this period, the missile sits exposed while technicians load propellant into its tanks. That fueling stage can create a vulnerability window because the missile is stationary and visible, making it easier for surveillance systems or preemptive strikes to target it before launch. Iranian engineers say they have worked specifically to reduce that vulnerability in the Khorramshahr-4 by shortening the fueling preparation time. If that claim is accurate, it means the missile could move from preparation to launch more quickly than earlier liquid fuel systems, reducing the time available for an enemy to detect and destroy it before it leaves the ground. But the Khorramshahr missile family did not begin inside Iran. Its origins trace back to a design that first appeared thousands of miles away, tied to a completely different missile program. One of the most interesting aspects of the Khorramshahr missile family is where its design originally came from. The engineering lineage of the system traces back to the Hwasong-10 missile, also known as the Muson, a medium-range ballistic missile developed by North Korea. That missile first appeared publicly in the early 2010s and immediately drew attention because of its unusually large payload capacity compared to other missiles in its class. Over time, analysts began noticing similarities between the North Korean system and a new series of missiles emerging from Iran's program. The basic structural proportions, the engine configuration, and certain design features suggested that the Khorramshahr project may have begun as a modified version of that earlier blueprint. But what Iran has fielded today appears to go far beyond the original design. Iranian engineers have spent years rebuilding and altering the system, modifying structural components, adjusting fuel tank configurations, strengthening the missile's frame, and upgrading the onboard guidance electronics. What may have started as a North Korean template has gradually evolved into something much more tailored to Iran's own military doctrine. The Khorramshahr-4 represents the latest stage of that evolution. It carries a larger warhead than most missiles in its class, uses updated propulsion systems, and incorporates maneuverable re-entry technology designed to improve its survivability against modern missile defense networks. In other words, what began as a foreign concept has been reshaped into a weapon designed specifically for Iran's regional strategy. And according to several reports circulating through journalists and regional sources, the missile may not have been used only once. Claims have emerged suggesting that the Khorramshahr-4 may have appeared in multiple strike waves during the conflict. In one reported incident, a missile of this type was said to have struck infrastructure connected to a U.S. installation in Bahrain, where the U.S. Fifth Fleet operates. The reported impact allegedly triggered a large fire near fuel storage facilities, supporting naval operations. Another report suggested a similar missile struck near military infrastructure connected to Israel's defense establishment in Tel Aviv, causing structural damage within the complex. There have also been claims that a Khorramshahr-4 was used in a strike against an American installation in the United Arab Emirates. Independent verification of every one of these reports remains difficult in real time, but Iranian officials have repeatedly pointed to these strikes as demonstrations of the missile's operational capability. More importantly, Iranian military spokespeople have used these incidents to send a very specific message about the broader conflict. They insist that the weapons used so far represent only a portion of the country's available arsenal. In public statements, senior officials from the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps have argued that many of the missiles launched during the first waves of the conflict were drawn from older production stockpiles rather than the newest generation of systems. According to remarks reported by Iranian state media, a significant portion of the ballistic missiles used so far were produced between 2012 and 2014. That detail may sound technical, but it carries an important implication. If the claim is accurate, it suggests Iran may be deliberately conserving newer missile systems for later phases of the war. That kind of strategy is not unusual in prolonged conflicts. Military planners often hold back their most advanced capabilities until later stages. either to preserve them for decisive moments or to avoid revealing their full technological capabilities too early. Iranian officials appear to be framing their missile usage in exactly those terms. In their public messaging, they have repeatedly described the current stage of the war as the opening phase of a much longer confrontation. And that framing becomes even more significant when placed alongside another major event that happened at almost exactly the same time these missile strikes were taking place. Because while these attacks were unfolding across the region, Iran was also going through one of the most consequential leadership transitions in its modern history. Just hours before the latest wave of missile strikes, Iran announced a dramatic leadership transition that immediately reshaped the political landscape inside the country. Shortly after midnight on March 8th, Iran's Assembly of Experts, the powerful 88-member clerical body responsible for selecting the nation's supreme leader, announced that Mojtaba Khamenei had been appointed as the third supreme leader of the Islamic Republic. The decision came only days after the death of his father, the previous supreme leader, who had been killed in a strike roughly 10 days earlier. Under normal circumstances, the selection of a supreme leader is a lengthy and highly controlled process involving internal consultations among senior clerics. But these were not normal circumstances. The country was already under bombardment. Communications infrastructure had been disrupted in multiple regions, and the leadership transition had to be handled under wartime conditions. Reports from international outlets indicated that the Assembly of Experts faced significant logistical challenges in even gathering for deliberations. Some members reportedly participated remotely, or through written submissions, because travel inside the country had become increasingly difficult during the ongoing conflict. Iranian media also reported that an auxiliary assembly facility in the city of Kay had been struck during the fighting, further complicating the process. Despite those obstacles, the assembly ultimately selected Mojtaba Khamenei to assume the position of supreme leader. At 56 years old, he becomes one of the youngest figures ever to occupy the role. But his appointment has also been controversial inside Iran for several reasons. Unlike many senior clerical figures who have historically held the position, Mojtaba Khamenei does not carry the religious rank of Ayatollah. Instead, he holds the title of Hojat Islam, a mid-level clerical status within the Shiite religious hierarchy. That distinction matters in Iran's political system because the supreme leader traditionally combines both religious authority and political power. When Mojtaba's father assumed leadership in 1989, he also lacked the rank of Ayatollah at the time, and Iran's governing structure was adjusted to accommodate that situation. But the current transition raises another sensitive issue as well. Mojtaba is the son of the previous leader, which has led critics to argue that the appointment introduces the appearance of hereditary succession into a system that was originally built on the rejection of dynastic rule. The entire ideological foundation of Iran's 1979 revolution centered on overthrowing a monarchy and replacing it with a republic guided by religious authority. Installing the son of the previous supreme leader inevitably raises questions about whether that revolutionary principle is shifting. Mojtaba Khamenei has long been a mysterious and largely unseen figure in Iranian politics. Unlike many public leaders, he rarely speaks in public and has almost never delivered major speeches or sermons. For years, much of what has been known about him has come through indirect reports rather than direct appearances. Diplomatic cables and intelligence assessments have occasionally described him as an influential behind-the-scenes operator within Iran's political and security establishment. In fact, during earlier political controversies inside the country, protesters even chanted his name during demonstrations, accusing him of exercising power without public accountability. Despite that relatively low public profile, he has been closely connected to Iran's security apparatus and to the network surrounding the office of the supreme leader. But what happened immediately after his appointment transformed the leadership transition into something much larger than a political announcement. Within hours of the succession being confirmed, Iranian state media released images showing ballistic missiles prepared for launch with handwritten inscriptions on their casings. One of the phrases written on the missile bodies read Lab Ya Mojtaba, which translates roughly to "At your service, Mojtaba." In Shiite religious tradition, the phrase Lab carries deep symbolic meaning. It is an oath of loyalty and readiness to answer a call. By placing that phrase directly onto a missile warhead, the message was unmistakable. The military strike that followed was being framed not just as a battlefield operation, but as a pledge of allegiance to the new leader. The symbolism continued in the naming of the missile waves that followed the succession announcement. One strike wave was reportedly launched under the code name Ali Wali Allah, a phrase referencing the divine appointment of Ali, the cousin and son-in-law of the Prophet Muhammad, as a successor figure in Shiite tradition. Another wave reportedly carried the code name Labik Ya Khamenei, explicitly linking the operation to the new supreme leader. In other words, the leadership transition and the military campaign were presented as a single synchronized event. The missiles in the sky were not just weapons. They were political signals, and those signals triggered immediate reactions far beyond Iran's borders. The reaction from Israel was swift and unmistakably direct. Even before the new leader had fully consolidated his position, Israeli officials had already made clear how they intended to approach the situation. Israel's defense minister stated publicly that whoever replaced the previous supreme leader would be considered a legitimate military target if they continued directing attacks against Israel. Within hours of Mojtaba Khamenei's appointment, Israeli government accounts began circulating images of him alongside his father, accompanied by captions suggesting that the son could face the same fate. The message was blunt. Leadership succession would not provide protection from military action. Similar rhetoric began appearing from several American political figures as well. Some described the new Iranian leader as inexperienced or unlikely to maintain power for long under the pressure of the war. Others suggested that if Iran continued escalating its missile operations, the leadership structure itself could become a focus of military pressure. From Thran's perspective, those comments were interpreted as open threats against the country's newly appointed head of state. Iranian officials responded immediately. The country's foreign minister stated that Iran would not permit outside powers to interfere in its internal political decisions. Senior political leaders inside the Iranian parliament echoed the same message, arguing that the selection of the supreme leader was a constitutional process determined by the Iranian system itself. But the reaction did not stop with statements from inside Iran. Two major global powers quickly entered the diplomatic conversation. China moved first. A spokesperson for the Chinese Foreign Ministry publicly stated that Iran's leadership transition was an internal matter and that outside powers should not interfere in the country's sovereign political process. Chinese officials also emphasized that targeting a newly appointed national leader during an ongoing conflict would be deeply destabilizing for the entire region. Shortly afterward, Russia issued a similar message. Russian officials criticized what they described as threats directed toward Iran's leadership and warned that assassinating political leaders during wartime negotiations could dangerously escalate the conflict beyond its current boundaries. These statements did not amount to formal military alliances with Iran, but they did signal a growing diplomatic divide over how the conflict should be handled. The United States and Israel continued emphasizing pressure on Iran's leadership and military capabilities, while China and Russia framed the situation in terms of sovereignty and restraint. That emerging divide began reshaping the geopolitical environment surrounding the war. At the same time this diplomatic tension was unfolding, another front in the conflict was beginning to heat up. For months, the Lebanese militant group Hezbollah had largely avoided entering the war directly, limiting its activity along the Israeli border to smaller exchanges. But in early March, that restraint ended. Hezbollah announced that it had resumed attacks against Israeli targets, describing the move as retaliation for the killing of Iran's previous supreme leader. Rockets and other projectiles began crossing the border into northern Israel once again, forcing Israeli defenses to respond. Israel answered with heavy airstrikes across several regions of Lebanon. Bombing campaigns expanded across Beirut's southern suburbs, across southern Lebanon, and deep into the Bekaa Valley. Israeli officials stated that one of their strikes had killed a senior Hezbollah intelligence figure identified as the head of the organization's intelligence headquarters. The escalation quickly created a humanitarian crisis inside Lebanon. Reports indicated that hundreds of thousands of civilians were forced to leave their homes as the fighting spread across populated areas. Meanwhile, the clashes along the border began producing casualties on both sides. Israeli military sources confirmed that soldiers had been killed during confrontations in southern Lebanon as the conflict expanded beyond limited border exchanges. International organizations monitoring the situation also raised concerns. about the types of weapons being used during some of the bombardments. Human rights investigators reported evidence suggesting that white phosphorus munitions had been deployed over certain residential areas, a claim that added another layer of controversy to the already expanding conflict. What had originally begun as a confrontation between Iran, Israel, and the United States was now spreading across multiple fronts. Lebanon had been pulled deeper into the war. Missile strikes were expanding across the region. Diplomatic divisions between major powers were becoming more pronounced. And despite the scale of what had already happened, Iranian officials continued repeating the same message to their own population. They said, this war was still only in its opening phase. By this point in the conflict, the scale of the attacks had already become staggering. Dozens of strike waves had been launched across multiple countries. Hundreds of ballistic missiles had been fired. Thousands of drones had crossed the skies of the region. Yet, Iranian officials continued repeating a message that surprised many analysts watching the war unfold. According to statements from the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the weapons used so far represented only a portion of Iran's available capabilities. In fact, several senior officials claimed that the majority of missiles deployed during the early waves of the conflict were drawn from older stockpiles rather than the newest generation of systems. Reports carried by Iranian media suggested that many of the ballistic missiles launched during the first 30 strike waves had been produced more than a decade ago between 2012 and 2014. If those statements are accurate, it means Iran has been deliberately conserving a large portion of its more modern missile arsenal while relying heavily on older systems to sustain the current pace of attacks. From a strategic standpoint, that approach would allow Iran to maintain pressure over a longer period without immediately exhausting its most advanced weapons. In prolonged conflicts, militaries often hold back their newest capabilities for decisive moments or later phases of the campaign. Iranian officials appear to be signaling that this war is not expected to end quickly and that they are pacing their resources accordingly, and that, at the same time, Iranian commanders have repeatedly emphasized that their missile program is only one component of a much broader military structure. Alongside ballistic missiles, the country maintains extensive drone fleets, cruise missile systems, regional proxy forces, and naval assets capable of threatening shipping lanes across the Persian Gulf. Each of those elements adds another layer to the conflict, and as the war expands into multiple theaters, the cumulative pressure on regional stability continues to grow. What makes the situation even more complicated is the absence of any clearly defined path toward de-escalation. So far, neither side has publicly outlined conditions that could lead to a ceasefire. No formal negotiation framework has emerged, no confirmed back-channel diplomacy has been acknowledged by either government. Instead, both sides appear locked into a cycle of escalation, responding to each new attack with another wave of strikes. Iranian officials say they will continue defending the country against what they describe as external aggression. American and Israeli leaders say they will continue targeting the military capabilities they believe threaten their security. That leaves the region in an uncertain and dangerous moment. A U.S. base has reportedly been struck with one of the heaviest warheads in Iran's arsenal. Leadership in Thran has changed during the middle of the war. Hezbollah has reopened another front in Lebanon. Major global powers are now taking sharply different diplomatic positions on how the conflict should unfold. And despite everything that has already happened, both sides continue to signal that they are prepared for the fighting to continue. Right now, the most important unanswered question is also the simplest one. What would actually bring this war to an end? Because until that question has an answer, every missile launch, every airstrike, and every new escalation carries the possibility of triggering the next phase of the conflict. And as long as both sides continue preparing for that next phase, the next wave may already be closer than anyone realizes.